Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika prana nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamritapayo Raso Murakedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Huilo Morachita Jeba nahi buji keva shunite shunite seha Kiad bhuta chaitanya charit Krishna upajibe priti janibe rasarariti Shuni le borohohit Shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam giyatam mura Chintyatam chintyatam bhaktash Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, and Sri Raghunath, a most graceful songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila, Sri Krishna Das, Kaviraja, Goswami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. We resume here in the Sanatan Shiksha, chapter 22, on the topic of Abhideya, and in this section on Sharanagati. So in our last discussion, we began to discuss commentaries on the celebrated most confidential of all instructions in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, verse 1866, sarva-dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja aham tam sarva papebhyo mokshayashyami ma shucha. So to begin this section, Mahaprabhu had advised to leave Varnashram Dharma, to leave aside a satsanga, to become a kinchana, and to take shelter solely in Krishna, to laha Krishnaika sharan. So to establish this principle, he cited this verse from the Gita. So in our last discussion, we looked at Sri Sanatan Pad's commentaries on this verse that are given in his commentary on Hari Bhakti Vilas, as well as an interesting take on the verse that was offered by Sri Jiva Gosvami Pad with reference to its citation in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So today, we'll examine the commentaries on this verse of Sri Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad and Sri Baladev Vidyabhushan Pad. So these are more or less presented in full. So they come from these two acaryas' respective commentaries on Bhagavad Gita itself. So just for the sake of thoroughness, there are some additional insights offered in these verses. Perhaps there is also some quote-unquote redundancy or some repetition with what Sanatan Pad has already commented, but I see no harm in discussing the commentaries in full. So we'll dive in. That should start from the top of the new file. So this is Chakravarti Pad's commentary on Bhagavad Gita 1866, which is cited here in verse 94 of Madhya Lila chapter 22. And because I'm going through the whole commentary here, I'm going to omit reading the source text as I go, just to save time. If anyone wants to discuss any of the specific words in the Sanskrit source, feel free to ask. So, he premises the discussion by considering that after the previous verse was spoken, Arjuna raises the following question. Well, should I engage in the meditation on you and so forth as you have just instructed in the previous verse, which I perform after first performing the dharmas of my own ashram, or alone? That is, should I engage only in meditation and so forth upon you without performing the dharmas of my own ashram? So just for context, the two previous verses in the Gita were cited earlier in the chapter. There Krishna says, I'm giving you my sarva-guhya-tamam, my most confidential of all instructions. And then he tells him, manmana bhava, be of mind fixed on me, mad bhakto, be a bhakta of me, mad yaji, be a worshipper of me, in other words, perform ritual worship of me, mam namaskuru, and offer obeisance to me. So, when Arjuna receives this instruction to use his body, his thoughts, his speech, all in adoration of Krishna, then the question can arise, okay, so do you want me to do that after I do what I'm already supposed to do? Or do you want me to do only that and eliminate what I used to do? So is this to be added, or is this to replace? So, it's as though Krishna replies to that question by stating this verse 1866. To that he says, completely relinquishing all dharmas, that is, all varna and ashrama dharmas specifically, take shelter solely in me. So in other words, the answer is, replace it. In other words, don't just tack this on or add to what you're already doing as a portion of a broader schema of duty, but rather eliminate your previous duties and consider this your sole duty. So take shelter in me, not in the path of karma, not in the acts that are incumbent upon you according to your varna and ashram. Consider your shelter me alone, not those acts of karma, not that adherence to the path of karma. So he adds, quote, completely relinquishing, or parityajya, is not to be explained as, quote, flatly renouncing, or sannyasya, because of Arjuna's inability for sannyas on account of his being a kshatriya. So, when Krishna is saying to relinquish these things or to leave these things, what Chakravarti Pad is saying is that's not the same as telling him to just renounce them. So the difference between quote-unquote relinquishing them and renouncing them, this is the Chakravarti Pad is wanting to establish a distinction between these things, because the idea of, quote, renouncing them is meant for persons who are not kshatriyas. Or, in other words, typically it's observed by brahmanas. Traditionally it was only brahmanas who would become sannyasis. So Chakravarti Pad is reading it that when Krishna is telling Arjuna to leave these things, it's not in the sense of, okay, now go off and act like a sannyasi. That's not exactly what he's saying. because it wouldn't be applicable to advise Arjuna in that way. So he elaborates, saying, and it should not be said that Bhagavan, merely making or using Arjuna as the object, instructed this only for a multitude of other persons. For example, those in society who do have eligibility for sannyas. So here, for anyone who recalls how Sanatana Pad commented on this when we discussed the Sharanagati Prakaran in Hari Bhakti Vilas, here Chakravarti Pad is apparently contradicting Sanatana Gosvami, because Sanatana Gosvami made the point that this statement is not for Arjuna, because Arjuna is actually an avatar of a Parshad of Bhagavan. He's known to be always a companion of Bhagavan, as they both descend as Nara and Narayan Rishi. So it's not like Arjuna needs to be instructed. So really, Bhagavan is just giving these instructions to Arjuna so that other people can hear them. It's not really for Arjuna himself. There's a classical example in Indian culture. Sometimes they say that when the son has married and the daughter-in-law is new in the house of the son's parents, then it takes some time for that daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, father-in-law relationship to set well, if you will. So sometimes the mother-in-law, when she wants to correct the daughter-in-law, she won't just start ordering or giving corrections to the daughter-in-law directly, but she'll have her own daughter, who might have been married off already or might still be at home, she'll give some instructions to her own daughter in the earshot of the daughter-in-law, so that the daughter-in-law can acquire this understanding without it having to be pointedly made as a correction to her. So this is said to be a matter of tact, if you will, in classical Indian customs. So something like that, Sanatana Goswami's vision of this is that it's more or less like Arjuna is like the daughter. He and his mother are, the mother and the daughter, they're very intimately acquainted. They can understand each other. They can play these roles for the sake of allowing someone else to learn. They're comfortable with that. So something like this is how Sanatana Pad sees it. So now the question will arise, well then why is Chakravarti Pad saying the opposite? Where he's saying, okay, it is not to be said that Bhagavan is just making Arjuna an object to instruct many others. So he elaborates for his reason for giving this viewpoint by saying, since there was certainly suitability to cause the instruction to be directed to Arjuna specifically, who had already become the object of Sri Krishna's instructions, another's also being one to be instructed by this statement of Bhagavan shall be possible, but not otherwise. That is, Bhagavan's statement can be accepted as an instruction for persons other than Arjuna, but nevertheless his statement was certainly an instruction to Arjuna himself. So Chakravarti Pad this is his reasoning. So my personal 2 cents as to how to reconcile this apparent contradiction between the commentators is that there isn't any serious contradiction. That Sanatana Pad's perspective is more based on an ontological sense of Arjuna being a Parshad of Bhagavan, being essentially perceived to be a divine being who's descended to this world with Bhagavan to play a role in his Leela, and thus is considered to be of an eternally liberated and realized nature. So he certainly wouldn't be entangled in sin or bewildered by ignorance or in need of being taught these things. Clear, no problem. Now, on the other hand, as this Nitya Parshada who's descended with Bhagavan, he's also very much playing this role in this Leela. And in this Leela, there is the agency of Yoga Maya, which does result in not only Parshadas, but even Krishna not being omniscient at all times. And if there weren't the ability for Yoga Maya to put twist the gauge on the level of omniscience or lack thereof that Bhagavan or some of his Parshads experience at any given moment in the unfolding of the Leela, there wouldn't be genuine emotions, there wouldn't be genuine relish of rasa, so to speak. So if we look at it in that context, Arjuna does need to be instructed, and he is trembling with bewilderment in the middle of this battle, and he is unsure what to do, and he does feel this great sense of relief by trusting his dearest, most wonderful friend, Krishna, and receiving his instructions and having all his questions be meticulously given elaborate discussion and so on. And so if we look at it in that sense, his, quote, needing to be instructed isn't inherently contradictory to his also being an avatar or his also being a divine being. So my personal opinion is that it's looking at the same equation from a different angle, so there isn't really a contradiction. Chakravarti obviously doesn't deny that Arjuna is a Nitya Parshad or anything like that. He's well aware of that, but he's, from that perspective, giving greater precedence to the unfolding and the experience of the Leela for Krishna and Arjuna as it's taking place. So in that sense, there is an actual meaningful exchange taking place, not just two actors putting on a show, so to speak. So that's my personal way of reconciling the way that commentators appear to disagree. Anyway, moving on. And in regard to completely relinquishing that is the word's intention or tatparya of only renunciation of the results of performing the dharmas of one's varna and ashram, is not to be explained, because of a oneness in the meaning of it with statements of Bhagavan such as the following being necessary to be explained. That is, quote, completely relinquishing should not be construed to mean that one only gives up the results of performing the dharmas of one's varna and ashram, and not the performance of the dharmas themselves. Because the verb, quote, completely relinquishing, should be understood to have the same meaning as other statements of Bhagavan that clearly enjoin relinquishing performance of the dharmas itself. Maybe that should be themselves. Such as Bhagavatam 11.5.41, which comes later in this chapter, 11.29.34, which comes just a few verses later in this chapter, 11.29, which came earlier in this chapter in the Prakaran on Shraddha, and 11.11.32, which came in the Ramananda Sangvad. So I'm omitting full citation of all these verses here just because they're already nearby in the same book. So some of these, or most of these, we've already discussed, and some we'll discuss soon. So the point, however, is clear. We don't, need to look at the entire verses to understand that what he's saying is that these other verses, and a number of them, Krishna and others, are repeatedly giving this advice. So he's essentially making two arguments for the idea that it's not just renouncing the fruits or giving up the fruits. One is that the word parityajya is used. So pari is a prefix which is indicative of completion. So that's what he explains or he elaborates on next. So he says, in this regard, the aforementioned conclusion regarding the intention of the word, quote, completely relinquishing, parityajya, is appropriate. Also because of the usage of the prefix completely, pari, i.e., that completely relinquishing means relinquishing the performance of the dharmas itself, the performance of the dharmas itself, and not just the fruits of the performance, is also indicated by the usage of the prefix pari. So if you were only going to speak about giving up the results or the fruits, you could just say relinquishing the dharma, letting go of the dharma or something like this. But if you intentionally use a prefix signifying completion or a complete relinquishing, then if you really only meant giving up the result and not giving up the action, you wouldn't use that kind of prefix, because that would most likely not, it would make it hard for people to understand what you were really trying to say. So this is Cakravartipad's second point. He's saying we should interpret parityaja to mean relinquishing the actions themselves, because in other places Bhagavan himself also gives the same instruction to leave the action themselves using other words, and this word itself, because it has a prefix signifying completion, is hard to interpret any other way. So for these two reasons, he's making this, giving this explanation. So now, he's saying on the one hand that what's being spoken of here is not sannyas, or not just, quote, renunciation of these activities. But on the other hand, he's saying, but it does refer to completely relinquishing them or not performing them. So you're not doing them at all, but you're not renouncing them either. This much we've gotten to so far. So what does he mean by saying that you're completely relinquishing it but not renouncing it? That will become clear as we go on. So he says, therefore, the intended sense is as follows. Take shelter solely in me, and not rather in dharma, jnana, yoga, or another devata. This is the meaning. Previously, you did not have the eligibility for one-pointed or ananya bhakti to me, the highest of all forms of bhakti. And thus, your eligibility for bhakti mixed with karma was stated by me, by my speaking to you statements such as Bhagavad Gita 9:27. Quote, O son of Kunti, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you sacrifice, whatever you give, and whatever you endure, offer that to me. Now, however, by my tremendous grace, eligibility for one-pointed bhakti has been given to you by me after having taken back the rule regarding this one-pointed bhakti in the form of its being attainable only by the grace of an independent one-pointed bhakta of mine, even though this rule was made by myself, like my own promise to not take up a weapon during the battle of Kurukshetra will be taken back during the battle with Bhishma. This is the purport. So Cakravartipad always has something interesting to say here. So one of the significant features of Cakravartipad's commentary on the Gita, which is a great contribution and enrichment of our Gaudiya Vaishnava literature, is that he traces out through the Gita how, although Krishna is giving instructions to Arjuna, he's actually giving many different instructions about different methods or different forms of practice that are meant for persons of different levels of eligibility. And thus, what this basically implies is that you can't just read the Gita. Or, in other words, like, I'll just pick up this book and see what it advises and apply that to myself. More or less, once you read someone like Vishwanath Chakravarti's commentary, you realize that you'll go completely left, right, and center all over the board if you do that and not actually do anything there's no guarantee that you'll actually do anything that the text is really intending for you to do if you just literally follow whatever passage appeals to you. So he meticulously analyzes the different types of instruction that Krishna gives at different stages in the text, and then reverse engineers or infers who is the eligible audience for that type of instruction, and what would be the outcome that would be achieved by following that category of instruction, and then gives ultimately the fruit of studying his commentary is the ability to both understand what one's eligibility is, as well as refine what it is that one aspires to, and therein by arrive at what aspect or which path among the numerous paths that Krishna teaches in the Gita would be the one that would be actually best applicable for oneself. And in addition to that, from you could say specifically a Gaudiya-centric perspective on top of that, a case would be made that these final instructions, given their being flagged in the Mool text itself as the most confidential of all, and so forth, as being the ultimate takeaway or the ultimate thing to be taught by the Gita. Now, not all schools of thought have that same viewpoint on the text. Followers of the Jnana Marg or others have their way of reading these same statements that privilege acts of bhakti as being the most confidential practice as somehow still not the ultimate import of the text. And, they have their hermeneutics and their way of getting there. That's fine, let them do so. But from Chakravartipad's viewpoint, there is a case for that, provided that one has the adhikar. And the adhikar classically for that is having gotten the kripa, or having gotten, in the words of Jiva Gosvami, the samskara produced by the association of a mahat. Or in this case, what Chakravartipad is calling an ananya bhakta, or a one-pointed bhakta. And that association comes about yadrichaya, in the words of the Bhagavatam, of its own accord, or in a manner that is independent of any ability to cause it for oneself or to earn it. So generally, one would only arrive at having the adhikar to receive this final set of instructions about ananya bhakti if one had gotten a samskar for that by the association of someone who cultivates that type of bhakti. So if you are familiar with that whole line of thought, which Jiva Gosvami spends a lot of time on in the Sandarbhas, and which we've also spent a decent amount of time on earlier in this chapter, when we discussed how the adhikar for bhakti is acquired earlier on, then if you were to be vigilant in following that line of thought, then you might object to this statement in the Gita, or you might find it peculiar here in the Gita that Krishna is previously giving Arjuna this advice of, karma mishra bhakti, which you wouldn't need to have had the association of a mahat to achieve, and Arjuna was already, engaged in observance of the karma marg, so he was already having the samskar, the adhikar for all of that. And now, in the matter of a little while in the course of a talk, now suddenly Krishna gives him the advice for this whole other category of adhikar. You might say, I object! Krishna, what you're saying isn't in line with Jiva Gosvami. Hey Krishna, haven't you read the Bhakti Sandarbha? It doesn't match. So this is more or less Chakravartipad's problem, if you will, with what's going on here in the Gita. So therefore he has to bring this idea and say that Krishna is breaking his own rule here. And he's now giving advice just because he wants to, because he deems fit, for Arjuna as being of a higher adhikar, even though in the middle of this conversation, Arjuna hasn't gone out and had any sadhu sangha in the meantime. So this is his way of indirectly accommodating Jiva Goswami's whole analysis and the other principles taught in the Bhagavatam and the stress given to sadhu sangha in the Bhagavatam, into how we can appreciate how this statement in the Gita comes out. So this is, in one sense, quite an important way of, I don't want to say salvaging, but sustaining a consistency of understanding between other Gaudiya works. So essentially he's just saying that this is an exception, and because Bhagavan himself is saying it, and Bhagavan himself can be considered the one who established this beginningless custom or rule, then he also has the right to override it when he sees fit. So this is how he accommodates the matter. So putting all that together, the idea is that previously he had given advice for doing what was raised in the initial question. So should I do this and that? In other words, I should do my dharma and I should also add this worship of you into it, the way you've advised me before. So here he's accommodating this and saying, no, now this teaching that's being given now is not karma mishra bhakti, it's rather ananya bhakti, so there's no need to mix it. Rather, you ought not mix it, and it would be mixing that's a fault. And you should do this alone, which implies that you should let go of these other things. So now the import here is the distinction between, quote, renunciation and relinquishing is that what Krishna is actually asking him to do is to take up another mode of engagement. So in that way we can perceive it, it's a distinction between you're doing something, okay, now withdrawal from doing anything. That's one approach, and another approach is you're doing this, okay, drop that, but do this instead. So in other words, he's not teaching him something that's going from the pravritti marg to the nibritti marg, but he's teaching him to go from the pravritti marg to the bhakti marg. So in that way, he isn't being taught to do those activities anymore. He is being taught to drop the activities, but it's at the same time not sannyas. Rather, it's a further step of positive engagement into the path of bhakti. So this is what we can put together as to how this, relinquishing is not renunciation, so to speak, of what he said earlier. Okay, so moving on. And it is not that you should have any fear of sin, that is impediment as a result of relinquishing compulsory, meaning regular and incidental karma on my order. So here it's as though Krishna is presupposing Arjuna's worry. Okay, should I keep doing my dharma and add the bhakti, or should I drop the dharma and do the bhakti? You should drop the dharma and do the bhakti. Well, if I drop the dharma, then won't I get the consequences of dropping it? In other words, won't I be culpable for the sin of non-performance of my duty? So, no, you should not have any fear of sin. No, you shouldn't worry about that, because you're only relinquishing it on my order. So relinquishing it on my order and neglecting to follow it are not the same thing. In other words, if you have a job and you regularly have to, do such and such activity at such and such time, but if the manager, the boss, or whoever comes along and says, okay, come with me, we need to do this now, you're not held at fault for not doing the thing you're supposed to do at that time, because the authority who is the one who wants you or disputes you to do that is himself taking you to do something else. So in that way, there's no fault arising from doing so. Performance of compulsory or regular karma is enjoined by me specifically in the form of the Veda, whereas now relinquishment of that is being enjoined by me in my own true form. So in other words, the order that I gave in the form of the Veda doesn't have the same hermeneutical force as my order in my personal form. In other words, when I, the person, give an order, that even overrides my order in the text. Therefore, how could sins as a result of non-performance of compulsory karma arise? They certainly could not. Furthermore, on the contrary, henceforth, if compulsory karma is performed by you, sins will occur on your part because of direct transgression of my order to you to relinquish them, take shelter solely in me, and engage purely in bhakti to me in lieu of them. This is to be apprehended. So this is a point that we've discussed many times in this chapter. It came up in regard to 11.29 in the Bhagavad that was cited earlier, and something we also talked about in the last class. So I think that's already well understood. I won't elaborate again on that. So, a doubt is raised. Well, like an animal sold for a price, one becomes dependent upon a person whose shelter one has taken. One does only that which the person causes one to do, remains only there where the person puts one, and eats only that which the person feeds one. This is the nature of the dharma of the characteristic of which is sharanagati. So he's referring to the illustration of Atmanivedana that Jiva Gosvami cited, where compared the person who does Atmanivedana to the sold cow. And once the cow is sold, it's the responsibility of the buyer to feed it, to keep it, etc. So, therefore, if starting from today, I live as one who has taken shelter solely in you, then my duty shall be only whatever is stated by you, be it good or bad. So if I'm now completely under your authority, and I have to do whatever you tell me, and you may tell me to do something quote-unquote good or quote-unquote bad, and I have to do that, then, pardon me, where is that coming from? Oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So this is an interesting point. He's saying, if I live as one who has taken shelter solely in you, then my duty shall be to do whatever is stated by you. Therein, if you cause me to perform only dharma, then what worry is there? None at all. If, however, you who are free in your conduct on account of your being Ishvara, cause me to perform only adharma, then what will be my destiny? So this is quite interesting. That Cakravarti Pod considers it plausible that at this stage, Arjuna is thinking, okay, Krishna, are you gonna put me up to actually doing what is good or not? You might assume that this type of worry wouldn't arise in the first place, that at this stage, having perceived the universal form and having heard all of these things, that he would assume that whatever Krishna would do would be dharmic. So it's rather interesting that Cakravarti Pod considers that even at this stage, Arjuna might still be thinking, what am I gonna do? What's gonna happen to me if you start causing me to do a bunch of adharma? So, to allay Arjuna's worry, as Cakravarti Pod reads it, he says, aham. That is, Krishna speaks the second half of the verse. I will free you from all sins, all past and recent ones that exist, and all that I shall cause you to perform. So this is quite interesting. In other words, the way he's reading it, Krishna's not even denying that he's going to make Arjuna sin sometimes. He's even having Krishna say, yeah, I may have you commit some sins, but don't worry, I'll block you from having the reactions fall upon you. So this is quite interesting in the sense that usually we think of Bhagavan as, utterly sinless and pious to the, greatest degree. So here that Arjuna would doubt and think that Krishna will actually make him sin, and that Krishna is saying, yeah, I might, or I will, but don't worry, I'll also block you from getting the reaction. This is interesting. So he assures Arjuna like this, by saying, I am not like other shelterers, incapable in this regard. In other words, if some mafia boss puts you to work for the gang, but then when you get caught can't protect you from the sins you commit, like Valmiki's family was content to have him rob travelers to feed them and wasn't about to take a share of the sins that he was committing to feed them. So Krishna's saying, don't worry, I can engage you in sin, and I also have the power to block you from sin. So for that reason, you shouldn't worry. This is the purport. Using you as a support, I am just teaching this Shastra to people in general. So interestingly, even though he made the case earlier that this teaching really is for Arjuna, the way in apparent contradiction with Sanatana Gosvami, here he's also speaking in the vein that Sanatana Pod spoke by saying that this teaching is largely for people in general. Do not grieve, that is, do not agonize for the sake of yourself or for the sake of others. Verily, all people, beginning with yourself, can live perfectly happily by completely relinquishing all dharmas related to oneself and others, taking shelter in me, and being one who is absorbed in thought of me, and so forth, as was instructed in the previous verse. The burden of freeing them from sin, the burden of freeing them from samsara, and the burden of bringing them to me has been accepted by me with a definitive promise. What is the use of saying more? So for a bhakta who's a Sharanagata, the Sharanagata doesn't have to worry, how will I cross the ocean of samsara? The Sharanagata just takes shelter in the boat of the lotus feet of Krishna, so to speak, and then the boatmen in the boat take them to the other shore. In other words, he doesn't need to, at that stage, it's not that he needs to swim, so to speak, but that he has and he can trust in the power of Krishna to deliver him. So what this can lead to in a literal, practical, psychological sense is that the psyche is purified by the power of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, by the power of absorbing the mind in Krishna in acts of bhakti. One doesn't need to, so to speak, purify the mind by any external means. One just needs to give attention to aptly engaging in these activities of bhakti, and those things itself will take care of the rest. One can trust in the purifying power of bhakti and in Krishna's due arrangements for one's deliverance. So, even the burden of their body and affairs has been definitively accepted by me. As it was said in 922, quote, I personally provide the acquisition and protection of the bodily necessities of those one-pointed, meditative, and ever-absorbed persons who worship me in full. So Krishna goes so far as to say, I'll purify you, I'll deliver you from samsara, and even, to ensure that you have your basic needs met, that's also my responsibility. In other words, you can trust that those things will come to you. So in a practical sense, it means do as much engagement in bhakti as you can and don't stress that you won't have your basic needs met. Trust that by virtue of your absorption in the practice of bhakti, that arrangement will come however it's meant to come. Also, don't agonize thinking, alas, so great a burden has been cast by me upon my own Prabhu. In other words, don't think, oh no, I shouldn't depend on Krishna for my maintenance. I should maintain myself. I shouldn't bother Krishna with that. So he's saying, don't think like that. Don't worry that you're putting the burden on me. Why not? There is not even a trace of trouble in that for me, who am possessed of affection for bhaktas and of true resolve. So to be Satya Sankalpa means anything can happen just by my resolve, just by whatever I wish. So in other words, I'm omnipotent. Providing you with some food and shelter is no big for me, and I take pleasure in it out of affection for you. So don't think you're burdening me. It's effortless and it's relishable for me. Consequently, henceforth, there is nothing else to be instructed. Thus, this Shastra, namely Srimad Bhagavad Gita, is concluded. So this is essentially the final instruction of the text. So in that way, he considers it to, quote, end here, although there are a few additional closing statements. So, in the view of Chakravartipad, this is the final instruction. So, in other words, be completely at peace, be completely absorbed, and be rest assured that your practical needs will be met and your ultimate spiritual welfare will be arranged. You can just focus on ensuring that you're aptly engaged in having your mind fixed upon me, in worshipping me, in bowing to me, in being my bhakta. As was instructed in the previous verse, having relinquished these other responsibilities and holding me alone to be your shelter. And being confident that no sin or further impediment will come about as a result of doing that. So this is, in Chakravartipad's view, what it means to be Krishnaika Sharan, or to take shelter in Krishna alone. So we'll look also now at Baladevi Dibhushan's Tika. Some of what he says repeats what Chakravarti Pad says, so I've dropped a little bit of it out, but the parts that are unique I have here. And he has a nice additional perspective. So we'll look at that. So Sri Vidyabhushan Pad illuminates further significance of this final and most confidential of Sri Krishna's instructions in Srimad Bhagavad Gita in his commentary. Now the way he, quote, raises the doubt or prefaces this final statement of Krishna is different than the way Chakravarti Pad sees it. And it's quite interesting. So after the previous verse was spoken, be of mind fixed on me, be my bhakta, worship me, bow to me, you will come to me. Then Arjuna has this doubt. Well, how is pure bhakti to you, performed through acts of worship, offering obeisance, and so on, as was mentioned in the previous verse, able to be performed by a person of heart polluted by endless sin in the form of past karma, so long as those endless sins opposed to bhakti to you shall not be destroyed by atonements, such as penances and prescribed duties or dharmas. So in other words, in the view of Vidyabhushan Pad, when Krishna says, be my bhakta, worship me, give your mind to me, then Arjuna thinks, but how am I going to do that? I don't have a pure psyche, I don't have chitta shuddhi, so I'm not going to be able to completely fix my mind upon you. I'm not going to be able to act as your bhakta all the time because I have all these vasanas for other things, so I'm not going to succeed in that. So should I engage in some tapasya, or should I keep doing these other dharmas in order to effect the chitta shuddhi I need in order to be able to really one-pointedly, cohesively engage in that? Because it was already taught earlier in the Gita that following the path of karma also affects the process of chitta shuddhi, and that unless one follows the path of karma, unless one reaches a sufficient degree of chitta shuddhi, one is not eligible for the path of gyan or the path of bhakti. So this is quite a relevant way of considering the matter, is how is it that I'll actually be able to do what it is that you're telling me to do? So if this doubt is raised, to that he says sarva, that is, he speaks this verse 1866. Completely relinquishing, that is, relinquishing by their very nature, all dharmas, those existent as atonements for past sin, such as penances, and those that are enjoined as duties. So here he's taking it he's taking it in a broader sense, that Chakravarti Pad read sarva-dharma as varnashram dharma. And here Vidyabhushan Pad is saying it can refer to varnashram dharma, and it can refer to prayaschitta, it can refer to tapasya, it can refer to those types of dharma as well. So adding that additional specification to the categorization of, quote, all, is insightful. So relinquishing that, quote, take, that is, approach for shelter solely me, Krishna, the Ishvara of all, who becomes manifest variously in the forms of Nrsimha, the son of Dasharatha, meaning Rama, and so forth, who is perceptible only by means of pure bhakti, who is constituted of eternal being, and who is the destroyer of all selfish desire, including that resulting from ignorance. So this is the key bit that he's adding, that take shelter in Krishna, understanding Krishna to be he who himself is the one who removes the kama from the mind. So this, quote, heart pollutedness of heart by sin, what is the pollution of the heart? It's simply kamana. This is a point we've come across a number of times earlier on with reference to the statements of Prahlad that we discussed in previous classes. So don't worry that although your heart may be polluted by other desires, that you won't be able to do this, because this activity is an activity of focusing yourself upon me, and I am the one who has the ability to remove that impurity. So, and he adds here, and not rather anyone other than me, such as Shitikanta. So just a little footnote here, this is where the sentence ends. I was scratching my head on this for a long time. Why does Bhavartha-dipika give this unusual name for Bhagavan Shiva here? I'm going like, this is strange. If he wants to say Shiva or he wants to refer to other devatas, why doesn't he just say that? Why come with, this name Shitikanta would be synonymous with Nilkanta? And I was like, what is this? And there's a Bengali translation of these commentaries. The commentator didn't comment anything on this. I was like, what is this? So this is finally, I was looking at this earlier today, and then this clicked in my mind. So this is my 2 cents on why Bhavartha-dipika just chooses this name Shitikanta. So how did Bhagavan Shiv get the name Nilkanta? Everybody knows from the Bhagavatam, the churning of the ocean. Vishnu wanted to give glory to Shiva, so when the halahal poison emerged, he told the devatas to ask Shiva to protect them, so Shiva drank the poison and got a blue neck. So then what does then, simply by saying, and don't take shelter of Shitikanta, what is the implication of this? The implication is that even the devatas, and certainly so many human beings, don't always come to Krishna or don't always come to Bhagavan Vishnu for shelter. They may also go to other devatas, and they often go to Shiva because he's Shitikanta, because he's well known to have protected all of the devas, and in the view of the Shaivites, they'll read it as he even did what Vishnu couldn't do and drank this poison. So this is what I believe is why Bhavartha-dipika used this word. It's just to very efficiently, just through, suggestive meaning, imply that although Bhagavan Shiva had the power to save all of these devatas and is highly regarded as a source of protection and purification, nevertheless don't go to him, come only to me. In other words, he who would be the most likely other candidate, that's being negated, and the name for that is itself sufficient to indicate that, we know he's capable of even that, but nevertheless still, this is being taught. So, take it or leave it. That's my 2 cents on what Bhavartha-dipika might be suggesting in this case. But if any other person has some further insight, I'm happy to hear it. Anyway, so this is, as Bhavartha-dipika sees it, Krishna assuring Arjuna that he should take shelter only in him and that he is a capable shelter. So capable that he's fit to only be taken shelter of, and so capable he's more capable than any other shelterer. So thus he says, I am the shelterer, the ultimate shelterer, the Ishvara of all. That is, the Ishvara even of all the devas led by Mahadev, Bhagavan Shiv. Will free you, a Sharanagata, from all sins, that is, from all your past karmas. So he's taking it here, the way Jiva Gosvami took it in the previous context, that someone might be scared of the impediments that they will encounter on the path of bhakti. Sanatana Gosvami, following Sridhara Swami, took it in the classical sense, that if I give up my observance of my dharma, won't I be guilty of sin? So now Bhavartha-dipika is bringing a whole other perspective and saying the sin that Arjuna is afraid of is not the sin of leaving varnashram dharma, it's the past samskaras that are non-bhakti samskaras in his own mind. How am I going to overcome those? So it's that Krishna will free him from those things that will be an impediment to him actually absorbing himself in bhakti. Those things, Krishna being the shelter, being the capable Ishvara, will free him from. So personally, I think this might be my favorite interpretation of them all. In my personal view, it might be the most relevant to the reality of the sadhana that most practitioners are, aspiring to engage in their life in today's society. In today's society, most of us weren't born into any type of highly dharmic family where there was any type of adherence to the karma marg anyway. So more or less it's theoretical to understand the attachment that people have to the duties of the varnashram society and their roles in that society and so on. But to understand that our past activities have created samskaras that are unfavorable to bhakti, that obstruct us from absorbing the mind in Bhagavan, that we can relate to very easily, or at least a fallen person like myself can. So to read this verse as Krishna giving assurance that I will free you from all of that, that in one sense is a way of reading this verse that is one way more directly applicable to a personal application of the verse in one's own life. So that's just my personal take on it. Anyway, so it says, in this way, the mutual responsibilities of the Bhakta and Bhagavan are shown. That is, the Bhakta's responsibility is to completely relinquish all dharmas and take shelter solely in Bhagavan. And Bhagavan's responsibility is to accept the Bhakta in his shelter and free the Bhakta from all sins. You should not grieve, meaning do not agonize, thinking, how are penances and so forth, which have been executed for a long time, and which are difficult to perform, able to be performed by I who have the desire to purify my heart, but have a very short lifespan? In this regard, it has been stated by me that because of the destruction of all faults, just by taking shelter in me, endeavors for such penances, for that purpose, shall not be necessary for one who takes shelter. So still he's riding this theme. Even the Ma Shucha at the end, he's also taking it back to that fear that Arjuna will have because of his own non-bhakti samskaras produced by his own past karma. So by saying don't grieve means you don't have to worry that you're not able to engage in the tapasya or the prayas chitta that is traditionally used to produce chitta shuddhi. You don't even have to worry about that. I'm going to free you from it. You don't have to worry the fact that you won't have time or the ability to engage in the process that might be otherwise needed. You don't need that process, and I'm going to manage it for you. So in this way, he takes the I will free you and the don't grieve, both related to that aspect. Okay, there's one more paragraph here. I might go a few minutes over the hour, pardon me for that, but I think better to just conclude the discussion of this commentary in one session. So, and it is not that, quote, do not grieve is to be explained as you should not grieve because sin in the form of impediments shall occur as a result of relinquishing that which was enjoined on the account of the impossibility of that is of sin arising, for one who has taken shelter in the Supreme Isha as a result of relinquishing those duties on his order, as there is so also impossibility of sin arising. In the case of an ascetic, as a result of relinquishing fire sacrifice, and so on the order of the Veda. So he's adding to the same line of thought that Chakravarti Pad and Jiva Gosvami already explained, so I won't elaborate on that, I think it's clear. He's just adding that even Gyanis also leave the path of karma to follow the path of Gyan based on statements in the Veda, so you're leaving the path of karma to take up the path of bhakti by my order. Why would that be sinful? Rather, an occurrence of a fault shall come about for one who has taken shelter in him as a result of transgressing his order to completely relinquish those duties by instead continuing to perform those duties. This point we've already discussed. And it is not to be explained that because of the occurrence of impediments as a result of relinquishing that which is enjoined by its very nature, that is, as a result of relinquishing the performance of acts of dharma themselves, all the results of dharma are to be completely relinquished rather than one's actual performance of one's dharmas, because of the non-occurrence of that, meaning impediments, as a result of relinquishing only the results of performing one's dharmas. Therefore, the relinquishing of dharmas of one who has taken shelter is by their very nature. That is, it refers to relinquishing performance of those acts of dharma themselves. And it is not that there is an inevitable occurrence of performance of one's dharmas as per the principle stated earlier in the Gita, quote, nor indeed does anyone ever refrain without performing an action for even a moment. Because of the non-occurrence of that is of any such performance of one's dharmas, for one who is engaged in worship and so forth of him, that is, for one who has taken shelter in him, as per the very same principle. That is, if one cannot refrain from acting for even a moment, then the moment-to-moment actions of one who has taken shelter in him will be acts of worship and so forth of him, rather than acts of one's formally enjoined dharmas. So he's just adding this one additional point to the same line of thought that Chakravarti Pad and Jiva Gosvami Pad already mentioned, where it's saying that actually you'll be at fault if you go back and engage in those dharmas after receiving this instruction from me to leave them. So then he's adding this another layer of analysis by saying, but doesn't it also say that everyone will act according to their nature? No one can stop acting for a minute. This is the condition of everyone. Then he's saying, no, that doesn't apply because you're still going to be engaged. You're just going to be engaged in something else. So that natural element within people that drives them to continuously act, that will just be redirected. It won't be stopped and it's not being negated. So don't worry about that either. So in this way, in the view of Bhavartha-dipika, Krishna gives Arjuna all assurance that his mind, his heart will become completely purified by his faith, by his taking shelter in Krishna, and by his engaging in bhakti to Krishna with confidence that that very engagement in bhakti will lead to the purification of his psyche, which will then further enable him to engage all the more in bhakti, which will then further purify his psyche, which will then enable him to engage all the more. And in this way, there'll be a positive unfolding and a gradual deepening of one's capacity and absorption, which is essentially what Rupa Goswami refers to when he speaks of these things called anartha nivritti, nishta, and so forth. So, this is what the commentators say. So just to conclude, collectively from these commentaries, the significance of Sriman Mahaprabhu's instruction to leave aside Varnashram Dharma and, quote, take shelter solely in Krishna, Loi Krishnaika Sharan, can be gleaned. So, what is Mahaprabhu saying in the previous payar? We can appreciate that in light of all this different analysis given by Sanatana Pad, following Sridhar Swami Pad, by Jiva Pad, by Chakravarti Pad, and by Baladevi Pad. So, this is how the Sharanagati Prakaran begins. So this is all the assurance as to how there's nothing to worry about. One is not neglecting anything else. One can come and do this. But the question can then arise, but why is Krishna so worthy of being the one to apply this path of Sharanagati and Bhakti to? So the next discussion comes as to why Krishna is so worthy of being the Sharanya, or being the Sharan that one takes. So that's where the discussion will go in our next discussion. And this week we'll end the semester of the Bhakti Ratna course, so there'll be a hiatus for a month or so. So I think we'll resume in sometime in May when the Institute schedule resumes. So we'll go on a break for some time, and when we get back we'll conclude our discussion of this Sharanagati Prakaran, and then the rest of the chapter goes into the practicalities of sadhana bhakti. So we'll get to discuss how to go about the practice of bhakti as per the teachings here of Mahaprabhu, and we'll look at the parallel statements in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Durgama Samgamani, the Bhakti Sar Pradarshini, the Bhakti Sandarbha, and some other relevant works. So, good things to come in the future. I conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free. Yes, I see your hand.
Yes, Pranam, Shri Krishna Sharan Dasa.
Pranam.
So I've been doing some thinking in recent weeks about the particular type of Sharanagati that's appropriate for the path that would eventually lead to Manjari Bhava. So I wanted to ask, is this too far out of the topic of today to talk about, or is it okay if we talk about it? Or
Let's see where you're going with it.
okay. Okay. It's relevant to the last several months of the class. But so can I share some of my thoughts so far, and you can tell me if I'm in the right track, or if you can correct me if I'm wrong, or
okay. If you wish.
So we've seen several different aspects of Sharanagati, and then two prominent aspects are the aspect of seeing oneself as belonging to Bhagavan. And then there's also the aspect of seeing Bhagavan as one's guardian and protector. And they're closely related, but there's kind of two different formulations. So I was thinking from the paths leading to many different kinds of bhava, basically any kind of bhava except Manjari bhava, it would definitely be Sri Krishna for both, right? One sees oneself as belonging to Sri Krishna directly, and one sees Sri Krishna as one's protector. So I guess I was wondering, in Manjari Bhava, you still see yourself as belonging to Sri Krishna, but it's sort of indirectly, because you see yourself as belonging to Srimati Radharani first, and then because Srimati Radharani belongs to Bhagavan Sri Krishna, there's a sort of transitive property of belonging, so it ends up belonging to Sri Krishna in the end, but really one mostly thinks about belonging to Srimati Radharani. But I was wondering, so for someone going in that direction, is it appropriate to see Srimati Radharani as one's protector, or to see Sri Krishna as one's protector? Like if a Manjari gets in trouble, do they go to Krishna for help, or do they go to Srimati Radharani for help? Or maybe both, I don't know.
I'm not laughing at it, I'm amused by the subject matter. Don't think anything.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I'll just say that this is, if I may, a loose parallel would perhaps be something like a child and its parents. The child has two parents, right? So the child can have some relative understanding of the roles in life that the parents play. If the child is hungry and the mother usually is cooking, then the child might say, "Mom, I'm hungry." Right? If suddenly, the power goes out and a tree falls on the house and there's water pouring through the roof, then the child might think, well, this is probably in Dad's department. They might, go quickly inform Dad at that moment of that particular need. So, loosely, I'm not comparing the Manjari relationship to a parent-child relationship, but just in the sense that there can be a sense of a plurality of shelter, and that in the neutrality of the Leela, there would be a common sense application. In other words, if the gopis are being attacked by Sankachuda, then they're going to look to Krishna, to manage this situation, so to speak. Whereas in other contexts, it wouldn't be very natural to appeal to Radharani, according to what the circumstances, according to what's happening. So I would file this in the category of something that will be very, very well and richly and naturally understood when the time comes. In other words, from a distant perspective without on the ground experience, we might, is it like this? Is it like that? But when you're there, it'll be very comfortable, it'll feel very well, it'll be just fine. And one will feel richly in the care of Radharani, one will feel richly in the care of Krishna, one will feel very fine.
Okay, that makes sense. So that fits with the Leelas in the Bhagavatam that, if it's a demon, like you were saying, that Sri Krishna will protect, but maybe if it's a more complex social situation or something, then Srimati Radharani would protect. But so for me, I don't even have sadhana bhakti, right? I don't have any kind of bhakti. So, if I'm trying to do kind of baby Sharanagati in the sense of like, very beginner, like making a first efforts at Sharanagati, then should I focus mostly on Sri Krishna because he's more involved, because his expansions are more involved with the material world, where Srimati Radharani maybe isn't as involved in the material world, so Sri Krishna is a better person to go to for material problems for the time being? Or what would you recommend for my situation?
I'd say there's some generality, there's some element that may be personal to that. So I wouldn't say that there's one sole way to manage that. But in the Bhakti Sandarbha, you'll find that prior to speaking about the practical processes of sadhana, Jiva Gosvami first gives his prakaran on Sharanagati, which is itself very noteworthy, right? That he discusses Sharanagati before any of these other things. And he also says that one can achieve even moksha, one can achieve even Bhagavan's dham without taking diksha from a guru, without doing any of these other things, if one really does Sharanagati. So there is a place in that perspective to take entirely, if you will, to what you might call the general process of Sharanagati, to Bhagavan, and that this can result in supreme spiritual benefit for someone. But, interestingly, after saying that, and after his famous statement, tam vina todiyatva siddhe, that without Sharanagati, one will never become his own. This is like one of the grand statements of the whole of the Sandarbhas, like really a big one, right? Is that without Sharanagati, one will never be accepted by him as his bhakta. He won't consider you his own person unless you're a Sharanagata. And any type of bhakti, any type of bhav, that's all what they call in Bengali, durer kotha. That all comes much later, if this fundamentally is not really there. So, some fundamental degree of that I belong to Bhagavan, Bhagavan is my shelter, or as it's taught here in the Caitanya-caritamrta, Tini more Prabhu Trata e Gyan, that he is my guardian, he is my deliverer, that this knowledge is the knowledge that the whole Shastra is here to teach us. Like a big, nice dose of that is very healthy, so to speak. But then, after this very important point, Jiva Gosvami says that for those who are Vaishishtya Lipsu, in other words, for those who aspire to some specificity, they can take shelter in a guru and engage in further varieties of sadhana bhakti. So what would, quote, specificity refer to here? In context, he just talked about entering the plane of Bhagavan, entering Vaikuntha, receiving moksha, etc. So what beyond that is specificity? Bhav. In other words, a more nuanced or a more intimate relationship with Bhagavan, or a relationship with a particular form of Bhagavan, a particular dham within Vaikuntha where Bhagavan exists as Nrsimha, as Ram, as Krishna, etc. That would qualify as specificity in that case. So, if we understand it in that way, then one of the essential features of approaching a guru is for those who seek to have a relationship with Krishna that is mediated by a specific variety of bhav. So if one is desirous of that, and how would one end up like that? They would end up like that if they had some sadhu sangha or they read the other works of the Goswamis or further into the Sandarbhas, and thus were so blessed as to feel some inclination towards that. So for persons of that category, then they're advised to approach a guru, and in the association of that guru, take up a path of sadhana. So that would also be colored by, or a feature of that would be, the specificity of bhav that one feels a desire for. So in that sense, there would be some, you could say, initial or preliminary consideration or interest in approaching, so to speak, or learning about both Sharanagati in general and a notion of that is specific to and aspired for variety of bhava. So that would ideally be something that one would consult with, or one would consult in that regard with persons who are personally practicing, who are personally trained, who are personally following a lineage, etc., that are concerned with such matters, so to speak. The ideal sort of textbook approach would be that having gone through these texts, having acquired this understanding of the process, that one would then put the process into action by approaching the sadhus, by hearing in their company about these type of subject matters, and then finding oneself some place where there feels, to be a solid source of guidance and trustworthiness, etc. And then as per the expertise and the guidance of that particular sadhu, one would then gradually go about, the process. So how and when and where that will unfold for any individual, that's an entirely personal matter, which has to do with their own present samskaras, their own variety of sadhu sangha, whatever fortune may come into their life in the present or the future. I'm not here to pass any kind of remarks on those kind of things, or to, try to, personally, I'm not of the thought that I want to influence that in another. In other words, that I think this variety of bhav is the best, or what everyone should do. There's plenty of people out there who are ready to come with those kind of things. Personally, I believe that that's a deeply personal matter, and that's something that should much more come from the volition of the individual who's received a valuable education in those matters, and that there really isn't any need to attempt to engage in any variety of persuasion in that regard. It's much more something that is ideally something that will come about as a response to the Harikatha that one hears, that is sadhu sangha that one receives, and that it can be a rich, deep, and natural unfolding without any type of coercion, without any mixture of, seeking to acquire, members in a group or any of these kind of matters. So, beyond that, I don't have any, especially in like a general class like this, is not like a place where I would jump into further specificity in that regard. So, does that answer the topic for you?
It does. Yes. Thank you. And thank you for being willing to take some time. I know it was a longer interaction, but thank you.
Sure. And of course, that's just my 2 cents. So take it with a grain of salt. And yes, I see another hand. Brajananda, it looks like.
Yes, Pranam Krishna Sharanam Baba.
Pranam.
So I would like to ask a question. How to put in perspective 2 verses. One is from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Caitanya-caritamrta,
Okay.
and the famous sarva-dharman parityajya. So it seems that there is maybe kind of contradiction, since even this Jnana Karma Jnana Vritam is made for a kind of Ananya Bhakti also. But we have also to consider that we don't abandon completely nor the karma nor the jnana, but we are performing it without being recovered. So how can we put these two verses? One is completely relinquishing, and the other not to be recovered by the karma or the jnana.
When you're saying that we are performing karma and gyan that's not covered, what do you mean by that?
I mean, in my understanding, that although we are performing our karma, we are not completely, we are not at all identified by the accomplishment of the karma, but we still have to perform it.
Okay, so by karma, what do you mean right now?
By karma is any kind of activities necessary for the sustenance and for the living in society, by example.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Is it clear, my question, or am I confused?
Yeah, I think I follow what you're saying. So, I think the might be clarified by some of the statements of Jiva Gosvami in the Durgama Samgamani Tika, when he speaks about karma and jnana in that context. He explains there that the word jnana refers specifically to nirbed brahma gyan and not vajaniya tattva, or in other words, it's not knowledge of Bhagavan or not knowledge of the process of bhakti that's referred to there, but it's gyan in the sense of cultivation of awareness of undifferentiated Brahman. And by karma, it refers to the duties enjoined in the Smriti Shastra, loosely speaking, Varnashram Dharma. So, from Jiva Goswami's perspective, the word karma there doesn't refer to all actions full stop, or karma in the Western sense of, whatever we do is karma. It's more in the technical shastric sense of duties that are enjoined for particular classes of human beings. So when it's saying that this is not covered over by them, it means that bhaktas don't actively engage in meditation on Nirbed Brahman, and they don't engage in those duties enjoined in the Smriti Shastra at all, or if they do out of a need for social cohesion, or what is called loka sangraha, then they do so without shraddha in those activities. This is Chakravarti Pad's explanation. And that for the sake of not disturbing others in society, setting example for people in general, they continue a token observance of them. So practically speaking, especially if we're not Indian, there's no application of that in how we would go about following this path, not being part of the Varnashram society at all. None of this really comes up, so to speak. So, in that sense, what the Gita here is saying, leave all these duties of the Varna and Ashram, and this verse is saying that bhakti is not covered over by that, because either one doesn't do it anyway, or if they do it, it's not done with shraddha. So, if we understand it in that way from Jiva Goswami's explanation, I don't see any contradiction there. How does it appear to you based on that explanation?
Now that you have
I think you might have muted yourself.
Yes, now that you have explained the real meaning of this karma anavritam, sure, it seems a little bit more clear. But in our case, when we are accomplishing karma, is by example the fact to dedicate to the family or to the society. So still, it's a kind of dharma that we still have to complete. It's my understanding. But when Krishna asked to abandon completely all kind of dharma, this is where my doubt dwells.
Okay, so if we frame the discussion as in today's society, in whatever country we live, we have some social responsibilities and familial responsibilities. So how do we integrate those into the path of bhakti, or how does this idea of leaving all dharmas and taking shelter in Krishna apply? Would that be the question?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Okay.
Baba.
So one perspective is we can go to the idea of self. So the most core construct we have is the sense of I and mine. So I, my sense of self, and what is related to me or belongs to me, such as my immediate belongings, my personal relatives, and my extended, so to speak, my world or my society or my country or my community or what have you. So when we speak of surrendering to Krishna and, quote, offering the self, then we can have this idea that I, along with all that is mine, I have now placed, or I put into the care of Krishna. I see it just as Sharanagati meant to say, I belong to Bhagavan, or Bhagavadiyo Hum, then that implies what is mine, I will also regard as his. So by regarding what is quote unquote mine as his, then I can bear the responsibility of it with the attitude that this is part of serving him, that this is part of attending to what belongs to him. So you can see some Vaishnava poets, they've written, songs and things like this which express this type of attitude or support the cultivation of this type of perspective, where practically speaking, if you were working some job before you came to the path of bhakti, and then after you learned all these things, then you might still have the same job. So someone might say, this guy's just living the same life. He drives the same car to the same building, does the same job, and comes home. So there might not be a literal transformation in what one does, but one's whole attitude towards it transforms, or one's attitude of this not being like me and my family, and this is like other and separate and not bhakti and not spiritual, that hard distinction can soften, and one can see those things as integrated to one's path of bhakti, and that one can engage in the service of Bhagavan and regard even the fulfilling one's social responsibilities as also aspects of following one's path of bhakti. So there's one of the limbs of bhakti is called yavarartha-nuvartita, or to proceed according to necessity, to acquire as much, not more and not less than what we need to sustain ourselves, which Jiva Gosvami means as to sustain our practice of bhakti. So what we do that is required to do that, we don't need to conceive of that as not my sadhana, that I get an hour for sadhana in the morning and then I have to go and the rest of my life and day is not sadhana. We don't have to see it that way. Rather, it's more healthy to see that everything I'm doing is my sadhana. I'm doing activities that are sarup siddha bhakti, or just activities that are bhakti itself. And then I'm also doing sadhan siddha bhakti. I'm also doing activities that are bhakti because they're associated with, because they support sarup siddha bhakti. So what activities I might perform that I deem or I find to be responsible and integral to the life that I live and the practice that I aspire to conduct, I can conceive of those as part of my sadhana, part of cultivating the spirit of a Sharanagata and performing sadhana. And in that way, we don't have to feel that this is, taking me away or this is some other thing. Although naturally we might be inclined to spend a bit more time doing Sarup Siddha Bhakti than we might always have time for. Nevertheless, it's favorable to try to not see a black and white distinction or just this dry otherness, but to see that all of these things, that I don't need to forget Bhagavan at any moment. I don't need to stop trying to satisfy Bhagavan at any moment. That the Thakur that I do my puja to in the morning, that Thakur is also in the heart of my co-workers. I can also honor the presence of Bhagavan in front of whoever I'm with by performing whatever activity is suitable to that social context in a way that leads to the well-being of everyone. And I can turn every action I perform in all my relationships, be they, professional or familial or social or what have you, into cultivation of my ultimate and, so to speak, master relationship with Bhagavan. And if we cultivate it in that way, then all of those things can feel integrated into our sadhana. They can feel like they're, they are our sadhana, in fact.
Yes, Babaji. But I ask this question because in the past, we have been accustomed to make a big a dichotomy between our ordinary life and the bhakti we should perform. So after a certain point, we may feel guilty that if we still are engaged in material activity, even if it's essential, we can feel guilty not to be completely surrendered or abandoned to the bhakti. This is the reason why I ask this question.
And how is that guilt going for you? I mean, I'm asking, in other words, like, to go on holding on to that kind of guilt, do you find that that's been beneficial to you over the whatever period of time that you've been fostering that? I think you might have muted yourself.
No, I mean if I have the correct understanding of what's the sense of a life for aspiring bhakta is. So, in fact, I think the guiltiness will disappear slowly from the sentiment that not to perform exclusively act of bhakti. But I think it will take time.
Yeah, I'll just say it's a balance. Naturally, we may see at times where we might neglect the opportunity to engage in direct acts of bhakti that we could have been, and so to feel that we might not have used our time as well as we could have, that's natural, and some sense of what they call anutap or repentance about that is perfectly fine. But at the same time, if we have this kind of indefinite sense of uneasiness about dealing with the reality of our practical circumstances, that in many cases is less healthy than just accepting and seeing that the circumstances that we're in are also coming to us from the very same Ishta Devata that we're aspiring to serve. And that we know that we're being seen in the midst of those circumstances, and that if we can respond to them and engage in them with a fair and cheerful spirit, in other words, to fulfill them in a way that's honorable and leads to the dignity of a Vaishnava's life in this world, and to the well-being of people, that's to make the best of whatever circumstances we have to go through, that also can give us a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, and that we are integrating that and internally, so to speak, connecting that with the sadhana that we might perform in a more literal sense when we have the free time to do so. So I would just say that rather than fostering a sense of unease or a sense of, oh, it's just bad and blame society or this or that for the fact that I have to work or the fact that I have to do this, rather just accept it and just engage with it and try to see the beauty in it and try to see how one can go through those activities in a way that is as much in the spirit of bhakti as possible. And usually beautiful things can happen. You can have rich interactions with people. You can be reminded of and, contemplate many things in the course of your daily life, depending on what kind of life and work you have. And rather than sort of see it only in a negative sense, to just, make the most of it in a way that's creative in response to the challenges. This is, a way that I feel would be a healthy way of having a sense of progress in one's practice, even in the midst of circumstances we might not find favorable. And of course, at the same time, use some good intelligence to, try to ensure that you have as much time for, perhaps more literal practices of bhakti as well. In other words, don't waste your time or, engage in some intelligent planning or budgeting or what have you at the same time. Anyway, I don't mean to give you personal practical advice, but just to say that, there is a way through these teachings to integrate and see that we can uninterruptedly continue our sadhana bhakti no matter what happens. As we were talking about in the Sharanagati Prakaran, just thinking, I belong to Bhagavan. You don't even have to move your mouth or chant. You could be on the job, you could be in a commute, you could be anywhere, it doesn't matter. You can uninterruptedly engage in some kind of bhaktyanga, no matter what situation you're in. Even if bombs are falling on your head, you can still, to the extent that you're able, have some type of cognition of Bhagavan happening in your mind, unless you're too much literally going into a medical state of shock, But, in other words, I just mean to say that the way that this path is designed is so beautiful and so thorough. If we draw upon its resources and get creative, we can be happy, even in the midst of what might be, generally speaking, unhappy circumstances.
Yes, I'm sure that works. Actually, the more I engage in Shravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam, I feel something stronger and stronger. But, the remaining of the past life, all the samskara and the activities, that is something that is kind of a break, for advancing in the practicality of the sadhana.
Absolutely. Thakur Mahashai, many Vaishnav poets lament about that itself, no doubt. When we struggle with our unfavorable psychology, it's no doubt an ongoing challenge for all. So that can also lead to humility. We can do the jujitsu of Dainyatmika Bhakti, as we discussed also previously. So.
Oh yes, that is also present in the Orthodox prayer that Jesus, please have mercy on me constantly. Mm-hmm. This is maybe what we should have in the same time that to belong to Krishna, but also to ask him to forgive for our weakness.
Yeah, sure. That's one way of praying. All right, well, we're way over time today. Pardon me for that, but we had some nice, I think, questions and discussions, so I let it flow. But I think it's a little late on my end, so I'll conclude here for today. And when we resume after the break, we'll get to dive further into this sublime subject matter of Sharanagati. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai, Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam.